My first unit was the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg. I spent a little over 2 years there. Then I was assigned to Vietnam, where I was an advisor to a Vietnamese infantry battalion. On my way to Vietnam, I spent 3 or 4 months in California learning to speak Vietnamese. When I got to Vietnam, there were no American troops in the country. I was there quite early in the war. I arrived in November of 1964. There were no American units, except for some support units. And I was sent to the Mekong Delta, and that's where the war was at the time. Yes, I was in a fair amount of action. Now, during the course of the year that I was there, the war changed completely. That was the year when we began bringing American fighting units into Vietnam. So when I got there in November of '64, there were less than 20,000 Americans in the country. When I left a year later, there were almost 300,000. So the war changed, and the war also moved north, whereas when I got there, the war was in the south, where I was stationed. The language barrier, even though it wasn't as difficult for me as it might have been, since I did learn some Vietnamese, was an obstacle in doing my job. I worked mostly with the officers who commanded the infantry battalion that I was assigned to. One fortunate thing for me is that they had all fought with the French. And as a result, they had a pretty good grasp of French. And I studied French at West Point. So every once in a while, we would lapse into French. But yes, it was very challenging. We did have an interpreter who helped a great deal. Unfortunately, just a couple months into my tour in Vietnam, he was wounded. And so we went out without an interpreter for about 6 months, and that was challenging. I came away with a good respect for the Vietnamese soldier. I think they were dedicated to the cause, and God knows they suffered for it. And I thought the officers were quite good. The problem with the Vietnamese army involved the lack of non-commissioned officers. Unlike our own army, there were no sergeants that basically run the army. You know, as a second lieutenant, when I was in the 82nd Airborne Division, I understood that the sergeant was actually running things. I got that. But they didn't have non-commissioned officers that did anything. And so that was the problem I had with the Vietnamese army. They were courageous people. We were involved in close combat. I was never wounded. I was shot at, but I was never wounded. And we had 3 or 4 situations where many of our soldiers were killed or wounded.
Was it difficult to fight an enemy that was so at home on that terrain? And you know, this obviously was a totally different scenario for American troops.
It was very, very difficult. It was a tough environment for us. The Vietnamese were losing the battle for the people. The Viet Cong truly were terrorists. They systematically killed off most of the civilian leaders, village and provincial chiefs. I saw the aftermath of several of those murders. Usually they would disembowel the village leader and just leave him out in the village square or a market for the civilians to see. So we were losing the battle for the people. And the Viet Cong controlled the countryside at night. That's when they did all their moving. I know we would send out some ambushes at night, but we did not control the countryside at all.
Were you scared?
Sure. Yes, I was frightened. Less so the longer I was in the country. I think you become a bit immune to that after a while. Your senses get dulled. But sure, it's a frightening experience. I was different after my service. I would say more than anything else, I learned to appreciate life. And the randomness of the combat experience reinforced that. You know, you can be standing next to another person and they're shot and maybe killed and you aren't. And so you ask yourself, you know, why him and not me? I just came to have a deeper appreciation for life. It also changed me when I saw how people, particularly the Americans in the country, cared for each other. You know, there's a bond that develops in any unit, and the level of care that people have for each other, having somebody else's back or they're having your back, is just an incredible experience. I didn't experience the dissatisfaction that American people had for the war until I left the Army and went to law school. I was, first of all, much older than the other people in law school. The war was unpopular. There were very few of us who had served. And while I got along well with my fellow students, it was clear that most of the faculty did not like me and the fact that I was a veteran and the fact that I'd been in Vietnam. They would make light of my age or my service. You know, gee, where were you? That was at a time when most law students went directly from undergraduate school to graduate school. That's no longer the case. Most people now will do something else for a year or two. And so it was mostly innuendo. And I wasn't embittered by it. You know, it was fine. It was what it was. I got through it.